The dawn was a flat, colorless gray, bleeding through the edges of the window frame. Clara woke to the silence of the street, a stillness so absolute it felt heavy. Then, the sound began, a rhythmic, soft scratching against the wood of the porch. She pushed the blankets aside, her feet meeting the cold floorboards. She moved to the window, her hand hovering over the heavy fabric of the curtain. She pulled it back just enough to see. There, framed by the dim morning light, stood a fox. It was not scavenging. It was not moving. It stood perfectly still on the porch, its head angled upward. It was staring directly at the window, directly at her. Clara felt the breath catch in her throat. She gripped the edge of the curtain, her knuckles tightening until they ached. The animal did not blink. It did not twitch. It held its position with a deliberate, unnerving focus that cut through the morning quiet. Outside, the wind did not stir the leaves. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her reaction. She watched the fox, and the fox watched her back. Clara leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching the cold pane. She expected the creature to bolt at the slightest movement, a natural reflex for a wild animal in a residential street. She tapped her fingernail against the glass, a sharp, sudden sound in the quiet room. The fox did not even flick an ear. It remained anchored to the porch, its gaze fixed on her with an intensity that felt almost human. A prickle of cold traveled down her spine, unrelated to the temperature of the room. She pulled back, her fingers trembling as she let the curtain fall, but the image of those eyes remained burned into her mind. "This is not normal," she whispered to the empty room. Her voice sounded thin and fragile against the stillness. She waited, listening for the sound of paws retreating, but there was only silence. She moved back to the window, peering through a tiny gap in the fabric. The fox was still there, a statue in the gray light. The realization settled in her chest like lead. This was not a random visit. The animal was waiting for something. Clara spent the rest of the day moving through her house with a forced, mechanical rhythm. She cleaned, she read, she made tea, but her eyes kept darting to the front door. She convinced herself it was a fluke, a singular moment of curiosity from a wild creature. By nightfall, she had almost managed to push the memory into the corner of her mind. She slept in fits and starts, waking to the sound of wind against the siding. When the light finally bled through the curtains the next morning, she stood in the kitchen, gripping a ceramic mug until her knuckles turned white. Then, it happened. A soft, rhythmic sound scraped against the porch wood. It was the exact same cadence as the day before. Clara froze, the warmth of the tea forgotten in her hands. She did not want to look, but her feet carried her to the window anyway. She pulled the fabric aside. The fox was there. It occupied the same patch of light, its body angled in the same precise orientation. It was not hungry. It was not lost. It was waiting. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She pressed her palm against the wall, her breath hitching as the fox turned its head, locking its gaze onto hers. The third morning arrived with a biting, metallic chill that seemed to seep through the very foundation of the house. Clara woke before the sun, her skin cold, her mind already tethered to the porch. She refused to look at the window for an hour, focusing instead on the mundane tasks of her kitchen. But the silence outside was absolute. It was a vacuum, pulling at her attention. When the scratching finally began, it was not a frantic clawing, but a slow, deliberate rhythm. She walked to the window, her movements stiff. The fox was waiting in the same spot, but its posture had shifted. It was no longer a statue. As Clara's shadow fell across the glass, the creature moved. It took one step backward, then another, its paws pressing firmly into the wood. It stopped, then took a third step, creating a clear, measured distance between itself and the door. It halted, its body angled toward the overgrown path. Then, the fox tilted its head. It held the position, its gaze fixed on the window with a strange, expectant gravity. It was not waiting for her to leave. It was waiting for her to join it. Clara gripped the frame, her knuckles aching, as the fox remained perfectly still. Clara stared at the creature, her own breath misting against the cold glass. The invitation was silent, yet it echoed through the entire house. She felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The fear that had kept her paralyzed for days seemed to evaporate, replaced by a singular, driving necessity. She turned away from the window and walked to the front door. Her hand hovered over the brass handle. It felt colder than usual, biting into her palm. She hesitated, her fingers curling around the metal, and for a heartbeat, the silence of the house pressed in on her, urging her to stay, to lock the deadbolt and retreat. She ignored the impulse. She turned the lock with a loud, final click that seemed to shatter the morning quiet. She pushed the door open. The biting morning air rushed in, smelling of damp earth and coming rain. It hit her face like a physical blow, waking every nerve in her body. She stepped across the threshold, her boots hitting the porch wood with a hollow sound. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat. She did not look back. She stepped down onto the grass, the frost crunching beneath her weight, and saw the fox waiting just a few paces ahead. It turned and began to walk. The fox moved with a steady, calculated pace, its paws barely making a sound on the asphalt. Clara kept a distance of 10 feet, her boots striking the pavement in a rhythmic, echoing cadence that felt too loud in the empty street. They passed the familiar rows of houses, each one dark and shuttered, their windows reflecting the pale gray light of the dawn. Clara watched the fox's tail, a flicker of movement that guided her forward. They reached the edge of the neighborhood where the sidewalk abruptly ended. The transition was jarring. The smooth, predictable surface gave way to a cracked, uneven path of packed dirt and gravel. The fox did not slow down. Clara followed, her footing becoming uncertain as the ground turned soft and yielding beneath her. Behind them, the last of the streetlights hummed and clicked off. The houses began to thin out, replaced by tangled hedges and long, unkempt grass that whipped against her legs. The environment was changing. Clara looked back once, but the street had already curved away. She turned her focus back to the fox, which was now leading her toward the encroaching fields. The fields opened up, vast and unyielding. The sky, previously a uniform gray, began to bruise with deep, heavy purples and charcoal clouds. The light drained from the world, leaving the landscape in a stark, monochromatic haze. Clara felt the temperature drop instantly. A sudden gust of wind tore across the open ground, catching her off guard and forcing her to brace her weight against the pressure. It howled, a high-pitched, mournful sound that cut through the silence of the fields. Ahead, the trees stood like skeletal fingers clawing at the low-hanging clouds. Their branches rattled against one another, a dry, clacking noise that filled the air. The fox did not falter, but Clara found herself squinting against the grit. She pulled her chin into her chest, shielding her face, and pushed forward. The wind grew more aggressive, tugging at her hair and whistling through the gaps. Every step felt heavier now, the ground turning slick as the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and impending rain. The fox paused at the edge of a dense thicket, its ears swiveling to catch the sound of the wind, before it darted into the dark, tangled growth. The thicket spat her out into a clearing that defied logic. This was a graveyard of industry, a sprawling expanse of twisted steel and splintered timber that had long ago surrendered to the elements. Massive, rusted girders lay scattered across the earth like the rib cages of fallen giants. Clara stepped carefully, her boots crunching on shards of shattered glass and corroded metal bolts. The air here was different, stagnant, thick with the smell of wet iron and damp, rotting wood. Every movement she made triggered a chorus of groans from the surrounding debris. A sheet of corrugated metal shifted in the wind, screeching against a concrete pillar with a sound that set her teeth on edge. She navigated the maze, weaving between mounds of discarded machinery that loomed over her in the dim light. The fox moved ahead, a ghost amidst the wreckage, its paws silent on the jagged ground. Clara felt the isolation deepen. The fox stood motionless at the base of a rusted pile of iron debris. It did not move forward. It did not pace. It simply waited for Clara to catch up. She slowed her stride, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth as she approached the mound. The silence of the industrial lot became absolute, as if the wind itself had been held back by the creature's presence. Clara stopped, 10 feet away. The fox turned its head, its eyes fixed on hers with a clarity that felt like a silent command. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed down to that single point of contact. The fox held her gaze, its ears upright, its body coiled and alert. Then, with a fluid, almost imperceptible motion, it shifted. It stepped toward the dense, tangled brush at the edge of the clearing. Clara reached out a hand, an instinctive urge to keep the connection, but the creature was already moving. It slipped into the shadows of the thicket, its form blurring against the dark, overgrown branches until it was gone. The space it had occupied felt suddenly hollow. Clara stood in the center of the clearing, the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides. She was alone among the ruins, the metallic scent of rust thick in her nostrils. Clara remained frozen, her pulse thumping against her ears. The silence of the industrial lot was no longer empty. It was heavy, expectant. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the jagged horizon of rusted iron and rotting timber. Nothing moved. The wind had died down, leaving the air stagnant and cold. Then, it cut through the quiet, a faint, rhythmic whimpering. It was thin, reedy, and barely audible over the distant rattle of a loose metal sheet. Clara tilted her head, straining to isolate the direction. It came again, a sharp, broken intake of breath followed by a low, pained vibration. She moved toward the sound, her boots scraping against the uneven ground. She pushed past a wall of dead, brittle leaves that clung to her limbs like skeletal fingers. The ground grew soft, yielding under her weight. Every step required effort. Thorns snagged at her skin, and thick, tangled vines forced her to crouch low. The whimpering grew louder, more distinct. She reached a thicket of dry, gray stalks and stopped. She gripped a thick branch, her knuckles white, and prepared to push through the final barrier. Clara shoved the final cluster of dry stalks aside. The resistance vanished, and she stumbled forward into a small, hidden pocket of the clearing. The whimpering stopped abruptly, replaced by a ragged, shallow panting. She looked down. A jagged steel trap lay embedded in the dirt, its iron jaws clamped shut with brutal force. A small dog was pinned in the center, its body curled into a tight, trembling knot. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She took a half-step closer, her eyes locking onto the source of the animal's agony. The dog's front paw was caught deep within the serrated metal teeth. The limb was mangled, the skin torn and dark with blood that had soaked into the surrounding soil. The dog's eyes were wide, fixed on Clara with a glassy, hollow stare of pure exhaustion. It did not growl, it did not move. Clara felt a cold spike of horror travel down her spine. She stood rooted to the spot, her hands hovering uselessly at her sides. The paralysis broke. Clara dropped to her knees in the dirt, the damp earth soaking through her layers instantly. She did not look away. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered inches from the jagged metal teeth. The air around the trap smelled of wet iron and decay. She took a steadying breath, forced her hands to stop shaking, and pressed her palms against the cold, rusted surface of the device. The metal was biting, rough against her skin, pitted with years of neglect. She felt the vibration of the dog's shallow, ragged breathing beneath her wrists. The creature flinched, its head dropping back against the soil, eyes closing in a flicker of pain. Clara tightened her grip, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the spring mechanism locked beneath the iron. It was a dead, heavy thing. She shifted her weight, digging her boots into the loose gravel to find a solid anchor point. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them, locked her jaw. Clara surged upward, putting her entire weight into the iron jaws. Her muscles screamed in protest, a sharp, white-hot line of tension running from her shoulders down to her fingertips. The trap did not budge. It was a fixed, immovable object, anchored deep into the frozen earth. She gritted her teeth, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps that clouded the air. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped the rusted edges, the metal biting into her palms. She shifted her stance, driving her heels into the mud, trying to find leverage against the unyielding resistance of the spring. Sweat beaded on her forehead, cold and stinging, but she did not blink. She pushed harder. The iron frame groaned, a low, metallic protest that vibrated through her arms. She felt the spring fight back, a coiled, mechanical malice that seemed to feed on her exhaustion. Her arms trembled violently, the strain threatening to tear her grip loose. She adjusted her fingers, locking them into the jagged grooves of the steel, and heaved again, every fiber of her being focused on that single point of pressure. She was locked in a silent, grinding war with the machine. Her face flushed, her lungs burning, refusing to let the metal win. The iron frame groaned under the relentless pressure. Clara felt a microscopic shift in the metal, a tiny, grinding movement that sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She did not ease up. She channeled every ounce of remaining strength into her palms, her forearms corded with effort. The trap shrieked, a high, piercing sound of rusted steel scraping against steel. Then, the spring reached its breaking point. With a sharp, violent, metallic snap, the jaws flew outward, burying themselves into the surrounding dirt. The sudden loss of resistance sent Clara reeling backward. She landed hard on her heels, her hands flying into the air as the tension vanished. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. In the center of the debris, the dog lay motionless for a heartbeat. Then, it let out a long, shuddering gasp. The pressure was gone. The jagged teeth that had held the creature captive were now buried in the earth, harmless and open. Clara scrambled to her knees, her hands still shaking from the force of the release. She stared at the freed paw, watching the dark stain of blood against the gray soil. Clara reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the dog. She moved with agonizing slowness, mindful of the creature's terror. The dog twitched, its ears flattening against its skull as it tried to pull away from her shadow. She stopped, holding her breath, and let her hand rest palm up on the cold ground. The dog sniffed the air, its nostrils fluttering. It let out a thin, high-pitched whine. Clara leaned in, closing the distance until she could feel the heat radiating from its small, trembling frame. She slid her arms beneath its chest and hindquarters, lifting it gently from the dirt. The dog did not fight. It went limp, its head dropping against her shoulder. She pulled it tight, tucking its mangled paw against her side to keep it steady. She could feel the erratic, frantic thumping of its heart against her ribs. She rocked back and forth, shielding the creature from the biting wind that whipped through the clearing. The scent of damp fur and dried blood filled her senses. She pressed her cheek against the top of its head, feeling the coarse texture of its coat. The dog let out one final, long exhale, its entire body relaxing into the safety of her hold. Clara stood in the center of the industrial lot, the weight of the small dog secure against her chest. The wind, which had been howling through the skeletal trees just moments before, suddenly dropped to a dead calm. The silence that rushed in was absolute, heavy, and expectant. Clara shifted her weight, her boots crunching on the brittle debris, and lifted her gaze toward the jagged edge of the woods. A fox stood still, a prickle on her neck. It was not looking at the ground or the shadows. Its gaze was locked directly onto hers. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. The fox did not move, did not twitch, did not signal. It simply held its position, a silent observer witnessing the end of the ordeal. Clara felt a strange, profound sense of clarity wash over her. The fox tilted its head once, a final, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement. Then, without a sound, it turned its back to her. It stepped into the dense undergrowth and vanished into the gray light. Chill faded, radiator's dry heat bloomed. Clara moved through the rooms with a new, deliberate softness. She kept the dog on a thick rug near the hearth, where the firelight cast long, golden shadows against the walls. The creature's breathing, once ragged and frantic, had smoothed into a deep, rhythmic slumber. Dog's ears twitched, no longer broken. It pushed itself up, testing the weight on its bandaged paw, and took 3 tentative steps toward the bowl of water she had placed by the door. It drank, then looked back at her, its eyes clear and steady. The house felt different now. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the damp decay of the fields. Clara sat in the armchair, listening to the soft crackle of the logs. She kept her hand resting on the dog's back, feeling the slow, healthy rise and fall of its ribs. The silence in the room was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was a sanctuary. She was home, and the world felt still. Clara's brow kissed cool glass, streetlight waned. She watched the way the shadow stretched across the pavement, mirroring the exact angle of the path she had walked days ago. The realization did not come as a sudden flash, but as a slow, steady settling of truth. She looked down at the dog, now curled soundly on the rug. The fox guided its path, a deliberate design. She felt a strange, resonant hum in her chest. a sense that the boundaries between her life and the wild world had thinned. She looked back at the empty street, no longer seeing it as a series of disconnected events, but as a deliberate sequence. Every step she had taken, every moment of hesitation, had been part of a larger, unspoken design. She pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the vibration of the wind outside. Her world aligned, no longer a bystander. Clara pushed the window latch up. The frame slid open with a sharp click, and the crisp, evening air rushed into the room. She stood there, breathing in the scent of damp earth and coming rain. The world was not a series of random occurrences, but a network of quiet calls waiting for an answer. She looked at the dog, now lifting its head to catch the breeze. It was a living testament to the necessity of action. Sometimes, the universe does not scream its intentions. It waits at the door in the form of a silent visitor, testing whether anyone is awake enough to notice. She understood now that the fox had not just saved the dog. It had invited her to step out of her own isolation. To listen is to participate. To act is to heal. Eyes shut, street's pulse felt, fate embraced.